Hello everybody and welcome to this, my first of two videos on the Nikon FG. One of the venerable and go-to starter SLRs, but I think that's probably not completely fair because these are great little cameras. Real quickly, if you learn better by reading, here's a cover, the image of the cover of my book on this camera. The book that I wrote about this camera follows along in large part with this video. It has some added information in it as well, and it's also a really good thing you can just toss into your camera bag if you need a reference on the go. So there's a link in the video's description to my Amazon Author Books page, so you can find that there if you would like it. The Nikon FG is a multi-mode interchangeable lens 35mm SLR. Okay, what does that mean? 35mm, easy. It can take any 35mm film and take photos on it. Multi-mode means that it has full manual mode up here on the dial, where you would manually select a shutter speed yourself as well as an aperture on the lens. Also has aperture priority, what they call automatic mode. You set it in here, select the aperture, and the camera will pick the best shutter speed for you. And it also has program mode. And for program mode, you set the lens into 22, f22, the shutter dial into P, and now the camera will automatically select the best shutter speed and aperture for you based on the film and the light that you have for your image. The interchangeable lens part simply means that the lenses can be taken off and a new one can be put back on at any time when you're not taking a photo, and it will not damage or affect your film negatively. And single lens simply means that the camera has a single lens on the front of it. Reflex means that the light comes through the lens into reflects off the mirror that's behind it into the pentaprism up here, and then to your viewfinder, so you can see in your viewfinder pretty much what's going to be on the film when you take your photo. The camera uses a 60/40 center-weighted meter that takes a meter reading following the lens being stopped down and prior to the shutter being fired. So what does that mean? Okay, center-weighted metering means that the central portion of the scene accounts for about 60% of the light meter data. Everything outside of that accounts for about 40% of the light meter data. It just basically means that if you center compose images, the meter is going to slightly bias towards what's in the center of your frame, and that's a-okay. Okay, how the meter works is that prior to taking a photo, the meter will operate, and it will tell you what information in the light meter. We'll see in the second video how to read the light meter. It will give you that information. But when you actually press the shutter button down, what's going to happen is that as you press the shutter button, aperture in the lens will close as the mirror inside of the camera is flipping upward. As those things start to happen, the camera will take a light meter reading. So let me show you inside of the camera here. At the very front of the lens box, right here where I'm pointing my pencil, let me tilt this back up to give you a better view. You can see that there is a little recessed area. There's a light meter inside of that recessed area. And what happens when you take a photo is that the aperture stops down and the mirror flips up. And that's when the camera in automatic and program mode takes a meter reading to calculate the exact precise exposure, and it uses that light meter cell that's inside of the shutter box there to take a meter reading at that point so that it gives the most accurate possible shutter speed and aperture if it needs to adjust the aperture for the moment that the photo is taken. The shutter speeds available on this camera are 1 second to 1/1000th, as well as bulb, M90, which stands for mechanical 90, and these are mechanical 90 is up here basically without a battery. You can trigger the shutter in manual 90, that's a 90th of a second manual shutter speed. Bulb also does not need a battery. Bulb is where you push the shutter button down and the shutter opens, and the shutter closes when you release the shutter button. In addition to all of these different manual shutter speeds, you also have aperture priority called auto and program mode. So that's what the different shutter speeds there. The viewfinder on the back of the camera, when you look through it, you will have 0.84x magnification and 92% frame coverage. Okay, so 0.84x magnification means that what's inside the viewfinder will be 84% of the size of what's on your film. So that's a bit of a reduction. 92% frame coverage it looks like this, what you're seeing right now, this graphic of a photo taken through the viewfinder and also through the shutter curtain. So you can compare what's on your film versus what's going to be in your viewfinder. What it means is that if you assume that what you're looking at right now is what's going to be on the photo, then about what's that, 4% on each side and the top and the bottom, and some orientation, as we just saw in the previous graphic, will be on your film, but not in your viewfinder. And that means you can crop a little bit in post if you had a slight misalignment to correct for things like holding your camera slightly cockeyed. Focusing screen in this camera is fixed. You cannot remove it. It's in there. You can see it on the top of the shutter housing area. It's the Nikon Type E focusing screen, which was widely considered to be one of, if not their best, by most users. The flash sync speed on this camera is 1/60th of a second, which we know because it's marked in red on the shutter speed dial as a reminder. And in terms of build quality and design finish, the Nikon FG was a step up from the Nikon EM, which is what preceded it. And the sash, the black trim between the leather and the chrome, this shiny black trim right here, was brought back for this camera, even though it was dropped during previous, I think it maybe just during the EM. Anyway, camera styles, they evolve and change over time. That's just one example of that. And on the EM, this sash was molded into the plastic of the body. On the FG, I believe that this is actually a piece of trim that's applied secondarily. So at any rate, it just is kind of neat to see how design styles and build processes change over time. The Nikon FG was targeted at the entry-level user because, and we know this because it directly replaced the EM, and it also added manual controls that the EM lacked because that was a shortcoming of the EM. People wanted to have their manual controls back. It was produced by Nikon in Japan from 1982 until 1984. If you have your Nikon FG, what we're going to do now is go over all of the features on the camera and talk about what they are. In the second video, we'll talk about what they do and how they affect your photography, okay? We'll start here on the top, though. Technically on the front, we've got the strap lugs, which is what connects a couple of split rings that you can use to connect your camera strap. This is your film rewind lever and also film back release lift post knob. Oh boy. All right, this is your film speed ASA ISO selection dial, which you can release and turn by pushing the lock release right down here at the bottom. And this is how in the second video we're going to select our, I take that back. Around the film rewind and back release, we have the film speed, the ASA and ISO selection. To select your film speed, you lift up the silver ring on the outside and you turn it to select the speed of the film you've loaded. So if you have 400 ISO film, you just select 400 on this ring. There's also an exposure compensation adjustment here. You can see that this goes from +2 stops to -2 stops. We'll talk about how to use this in the second video and what that means, but basically if you push this lock release, now you can adjust your exposure compensation to intentionally give the film more light or to intentionally give the film less light. So very useful for things like bracketing and double exposures, and we'll talk about double exposure use for that in the second video. For bracketing, basically, we'll cover that right now. If you want to shoot it in automatic mode and shoot a series of 5 photos, each with slightly different settings, you can do that, and that will allow you in complicated high contrast settings like beaches, snowfields, if you're photographing a building with like the sun reflecting off of it, to get different exposure settings so that, yeah, not all 5 are going to turn out, but one of them will, or maybe you only take 3 or something like that. However you want to adjust your exposure to control your exposure settings. Flash hot shoe, film advance lever. This is your audio beep on off switch. That's all it does. Just when you can see that symbol, the camera is going to beep at certain times. When you can't, it'll be silent. Basically, it'll beep, for instance, if you don't have enough light. So let me go into auto mode, F22. And that's not going to work. I might not have batteries in this right now. At any rate, that should beep when you don't have enough light or when you have too much light to let you know that your exposure won't turn out. It does not have anything to do with focus. This camera cannot tell you whether or not you're properly focused by itself. You can only do that by eye, looking on the focusing screen. We'll talk about that in the second video. This index, this black line here, is the shutter speed index. It tells you what shutter speed you're set to. If you're in A mode or P mode, This little button here is your mode lock release, and it will allow you to switch out of those. You can see A is locked, P is locked, and in order to switch out of them I have to push down on this and then adjust my shutter speed dial myself. This little symbol down here on the bottom is your film plane indicator, and for things like high magnification microscopy, you can measure the exact distance from the film plane to your subject to calculate exposures and magnification ratios. This is your shutter release button right here. You'll notice it might notice it has a threaded little socket inside of it for cable releases and things like that. Over here we have your frame count window. Going now to the front of the camera, make, model, self-timer lever right here. We have the lens mounting ring, lens lock pin, lens release button, lens mounting index. This is your lens meter coupling right here. So this little dude right here rotates as the aperture ring on your lens rotates, and this part of your lens right here engages this plastic piece on your camera, and as this when you mount your lens, it'll be wide open. Whenever you are metering, your lens will be wide open. That's the way it's supposed to work. When you actually take the photo, at that point your lens will stop down. Okay, so your lens should not stop down when it's mounted on the camera if it's mounted correctly, except when you're taking a photo. And as you adjust the aperture ring on your lens, you can see that this little part here moves with the aperture ring, and it engages this meter coupling to tell the camera what aperture you've selected, so that even though the lens is wide open when you meter, the camera will know what aperture it's going to shut down to, and it will tell you the proper exposure information in the viewfinder. Okay, that's how that works. And right here we have something called the exposure compensation button. And what this does is it adds 2 stops of light. It is literally the exact same thing as coming up here to the EV dial and rotating that to +2. I guess theoretically you could do that and now add 4 stops of light if you wanted to. That's a whole lot of light to add. But basically, the way that the button here on the front works, the exposure compensation button, let's say that you're with a friend and you are sitting under the shade of a cafe awning and there's a bright city scene or beach or forest or whatever in the background, and you want to take a picture of your friend. If you just metered that scene, you put your friend over here to the side and then it's scenic stuff over here. If you just metered that scene with your friend in the shade and scenic stuff that's very bright, the scenic stuff will be properly exposed and your friend's just going to be a dark blob in your photo. What you do in that situation is you compose your photos you want, you hold down this button, it adds 2 stops of light, your friend will be properly exposed, this will be overexposed, but in post you can recover a lot of that overexposed information and get an image that shows your friend and the scenic stuff. That's the reason that this is included in what it's used for. The self-timer is pretty straightforward. All you have to do is rotate the dial down here, and then, nope, that's not the button, you hit the shutter button. There you go. The back of the camera only has a couple of things worth noting. This is the film memo holder right here. When you take a roll of film out of the box, you're going to tear the top of the box off and you're just going to slide that box top. Well, this one's been used a few times, it doesn't want to go in anymore. But you slide the box top right into this film memo holder, and that will tell you things like the type of film, the number of exposures, the speed, color, black and white, slide, whatever. So you can just look at the back of the camera and know what kind of film you have. If it's empty, if you take that box top out whenever you're done, it's a good way to know empty memo holder, empty film cassette. You can open up the camera safely. Okay. Viewfinder window up here. This is what you look through to compose your image and get your metering info. We'll talk about this extensively in video 2. The bottom of the camera has just a bunch of stuff to go over. This right here is the mechanical linkage for your motor drive. If you have a motor drive, then this right here is where the gears connect with that motor drive to advance the film for you. If you don't have a motor drive, don't go out of your way to get one, quite honestly. They do add a lot of size and weight, especially the older motor drives from the 80s. Film rewind release button, we'll talk about this a lot in the second video. Serial number, made in Japan. Tripod socket, so you can connect this camera to a tripod. This is your battery cap, and underneath this is where the batteries go. We'll see that at the beginning of video 2. These are the electronic contacts for your motor drive. So if you do have that motor drive, these are the contacts that talk to that motor drive to tell it when to advance the film. To get inside of the camera, all you have to do is lift up the film back release, and as soon as you pull it just far enough, the back should open up very easily. This one springs open a little bit more than most of them do, but it should open. This is the film cassette chamber. In video 2, I'll show you how to load the film into here, but this is where it'll go. This is your shutter curtain area. So these shutters open and close when the photo is taken to give you an image. These 4 silver rails are your film guide rails, and what they do is they help to keep the film properly aligned and flat as it moves through the camera. So the outer 2 keep the film from moving up and down so that it's properly aligned, and then these inner 2 work with the film pressure plate, I'll show you that in just a second, to keep the film flat so that the film is properly aligned for where the lens is going to focus light to create an image. These contacts right here will work if you have a data back for this camera. If you don't have a data back, don't go out of your way to get one. They're big, they add some bulk and weight, and I'm pretty sure the date range on them doesn't apply anymore. So just if you do have a data back, you can find a replacement standard back. It'll cut down on the size and weight of your camera. This is the film take-up spool right here, and when you advance your film, this spins in this direction to pull the film through the camera this way, and we'll see that in the second video and why that's important. It has a couple of purposes. It pulls the camera through that way, but it also will not spin backwards. When film is inside of a cassette, it tends to build up a memory and wants to curl back on itself like that. And so if this spun freely, the film would pull itself back into the cassette and you would end up with frames overlapping themselves, okay? So this only allows the film to advance unless you push the film rewind button down, and now it spins freely so that the film can be rewound. This is the film take-up spool, and after we load film, this is where it's taken up. You'll see that in video 2. Now if we go over here to the camera door, there's this little lever right here. I'm going to push down on this, and now I can angle the door out of the back of the camera, which allows us to see how it lines up with the camera's internal components. This is your film pressure plate right here. And what it does is it rests over here between these guide rails so that the film is sandwiched between the inner guide rails and this to be flat for proper alignment with the lens. This little retaining spring right here, it's not very pronounced on this camera, but what it does is it keeps the film cassette properly aligned in the cassette chamber so that the film advances off of it and is spun back into it smoothly and evenly. To remount the door into the camera, I'm just going to angle the pin at the bottom of the hinge back in, start lifting this up, slide this pin downward just a bit, align the top pin with the top of the hinge, and it just clicks right into place. I do have some tips for you on how to use your Nikon FG. The first one is that being a center-weighted camera, if you have bright areas in the center of your frame, say the sky, this will bias your exposure and everything else in the frame is going to be a little bit underexposed. And so that's another case, I guess, where you could use the EV comp button or the EV comp dial to adjust to counter that. So that's really the most important tip, is that when you are using this, just be mindful of very bright, or if you were taking a photo of this scene, very dark areas in the center of your frame, and that's going to help you make sure that you meter correctly. And it's one of those things you'll learn as you use this camera, how it behaves in that regard. I also have some things not to do with your camera. Don't store your camera with the shutter ready to fire. Anytime you're done with it, trigger the shutter. The reason for that is that the shutter is got some mechanical components in it. And when you arm the shutter with a film advance lever, that puts tension on some springs and things like that. And if they stay under tension, they can become fatigued, that can throw off timing, or worst case scenario, it can cause some of those springs to fail, which will brick your camera. The next thing is, inside of the camera we saw the shutter. Don't touch that shutter because your finger oils can get on it, and when they do, they can mess up the operation, or worst case, if you push those shutter leaves too hard and they skip into the wrong track, then they can intersect each other and they can jam the shutter and brick your camera. And a new shutter repair on these is more expensive than just buying a new camera. Behind the lens, you saw the mirror a couple of times. Don't touch that mirror with your fingers because your finger oils can tarnish it, and that will affect your metering and ability to focus with this camera. Don't leave your Nikon FG in your car. It can get stolen. The heat, if it's the summertime, can cause the lubricating oils in the lenses in the camera body to get very thin, and then they get to places they shouldn't be. And when they get back to their proper viscosity, they can cause components not to work properly. Likewise, extreme heat can cause damage to the plastic components of the camera's body. Also, in extreme cold, the plastic components can be damaged, but the lubricating oils can break down. They become really thick and gummy, and then they don't work properly as well. Don't store your camera in a plastic bag or box unless you have a good and rechargeable desiccant pack. This is not the desiccant pack that came with your Gucci bag or your bag of grocery store or gas station beef jerky. It's a desiccant pack you can toss into the oven to recharge when it's no good anymore. The reason for that is because plastic is moisture permeable, and moisture will get into your lens and it can cause fungus to grow. It will get into your camera covering, and then mildew can grow, and that's not great when you hold this up to your nose. So fungus in your lens also can affect your image quality. You don't want to do that. So if you're going to store it in a plastic bag or box, definitely have a desiccant pack in there. Also, don't let your camera get wet. It's not weather sealed. It does have electronic components. Water and electronics don't get along, so you'd want to prevent this from getting wet because that will ruin your camera. And just remember that your Nikon FG is a precision tool that should be handled with care and respect. And as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. So that's it for the first video in this series. Here's a card that will take you to the second video.